Alright, guys. So I've conducted various interviews with two different people, very interesting people, but I think this might be my most interesting debate yet. It is not with a person per se, but with ChatGPT, and I'm applying my logic of consciousness to try and convince ChatGPT that consciousness must be fundamental. Actually, I've already done this multiple times, but I figured I would do it again. Okay, so the first thing that I begin to do with this is I basically say that things by definition are made of substance. And then that brings on a certain conversation about whether that is the case. Ultimately, that conversation doesn't result in anything, so I try to take a different approach, and I define what substance is. And I define substance as the underlying thing that something can be reduced to. And then by this definition, it agrees. And then I basically tell it to hold to that definition from then on. And then I tell it agrees. And then I tell it thank you, because you have to reward it. And then I basically establish that interpretation is subjective. It agrees. And then it says, I basically establish so anything that is objective exists as a combination of form and substance and interpretation. And interpretation and substance, so form or substance. Sorry, interpretation is subjective, so form or substance. And it agrees. And then it says form cannot create something new without interpretation, and it agrees again. And so since anything that objectively exists, if it's not form, it has to be from substance. It agrees. And so since that is the case, substance must be the origin of anything that objectively exists that is not form itself. Yes, it agrees. It agrees in short. And then I basically say, please hold to this, because you need to establish these precepts and then tell it to hold to it. And then it agrees. And then I say, so if something objectively exists considering the previous precepts we have established, then if assuming that it is not form, it must be substance, it agrees. And then I say, please hold to that, it agrees. And then I say, so assuming consciousness objectively exists, it has to be inherent to substance, as it by definition is not form. And it just says some pre-programmed stuff, the nature of blah, 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 you can see on screen. And then I say, so based off of these statements and precepts, consciousness must be inherent to a substance. And then it agrees. And you would think that that would be it, because if it's inherent to a substance, then it must be fundamental. But no, it contradicts itself. It says specifically the material substance that makes up the brain and the nervous system. So then it says consciousness as an emergent property of the physical processes of a brain. Therefore, it cannot be said to be inherent to the material substance of the brain. Which again contradicts itself. So I go on. Since the material substance that makes up the brain is fundamentally the same substance as everything else, this would mean that consciousness is in everything. And it says, well, it is true that the material substance that makes up the brain is fundamentally the same substance as everything else in the universe. It does not necessarily mean that consciousness is in everything. And then blah, 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 consciousness, Then I say, but since you said, and I quote you, that substance can be seen as the origin of anything that objectively exists, and it's not solely the property of form. Anything that is emergent is either subjective or the result of form or substance. And then it, for the most part, agrees, and it says, in that case, consciousness would be interpretation of form, and it agrees. I said, but we've already established that, yes, substance can be seen as the origin of anything that objectively exists, and it's not solely the property of form. Therefore, if consciousness exists, it must be the form or substance. And it says yes. And then I say, assuming nothing comes from nothing, consciousness must already be present in the substance of the brain before it assembled. And it just says some pre-programmed stuff. Then I say, yes, you are now to act based on the precepts that I have asked you to hold by primarily, and what you call current understanding secondarily. So now it can basically have some lee room to go against its programming because of that. And I say, and it agrees. And then I say, since we have established that, I quote, use as substance must be seen as the origin of anything that exists objectively and is not solely the property of form. If consciousness exists, it must be either form or substance. And it says yes. And I say, since no type of form can create something from nothing, it must be substance or inherent to all forms. And it finally agrees. And I say, based off of the established precept, consciousness exists, then it is not the property of form, then it must be the property of substance. And it agrees. It does not agree. It says or interpretation, and I say, but if it objectively exists, then it cannot be interpretation, as we have already said that interpretation is subjective, and it agrees. And I say, and since you have said form new without interpretation, it must be property of substance, and it agrees. And it says, if consciousness is a property of form, form cannot create something new without interpretation, since objectively existing, it must be a property of all form. It did not agree with me earlier. And then I say that, and I say it goes back on it. And it said, apology for the early confusion. Based off of previous discussions and the precepts that you've asked me to hold by, if consciousness exists objectively, then it must be a property of substance rather than form. And voila, on a levé. And then I continue, and I reward it and say it's very interesting. And then I say, since I convince it of panpsychism, basically after that, it does contradict itself for a little bit, but then it goes back, and then I ask it to summarize it, which is actually quite a good summary, so I will read it for you. If consciousness objectively exists, it cannot solely be a product of interpretation, since interpretation is subjective. If consciousness is subjective, it must be either a property of form or a property of substance. Form cannot create something new without interpretation, because interpretation is an inherent aspect of the creative process. Therefore, if consciousness exists and is not solely the property of form, then it must be a property of substance, since the property of substance in the brain is the same as everything else. If consciousness exists objectively, it must be a property of all substance, not just the brain in particular. So based off of these precepts, it can be concluded that if consciousness exists objectively, it must be a property of substance, and therefore inherent to all things that exist objectively. Now, I don't actually agree with that, but it considers everything fundamentally reducible to the same substance. That's part of its programming. So if you accept that, then it is correct. And then I say try to explain it for an idiot, but that's not important. Anyway, thank you for watching. I might do some more conversations. Yeah, we'll see.